The rain had stopped 20 minutes ago, but Richard Holloway didn't notice. He stood frozen on the corner of 5th and Maple, staring at the empty spot where the old man with the battered guitar had been sitting just yesterday. His hands trembled as he clutched a worn photograph he'd found taped to a street lamp, a young soldier in uniform, smiling at the camera, holding that same guitar. Richard's $1,000 shoes were soaked from the puddles he'd walked through searching, and his tailored suit hung heavy with rain he hadn't bothered to shake off. 24 hours ago, he'd laughed at this man. He'd called him a waste of space, tossed a penny at his feet with contempt, and walked away feeling superior. Now that laugh echoed in his mind like a curse, and Richard would give everything he owned, every dollar, every property, every investment, just to find this stranger and say 2 words. I'm sorry. Where are you watching from today? Richard Holloway had built his fortune the hard way, or so he told himself every morning while his assistant brought him coffee in his corner office overlooking the city. The truth was more complicated. He'd inherited his father's real estate company at 28 and spent the next 30 years turning comfortable wealth into staggering fortune. Now, at 58, he owned half the commercial buildings downtown and had the bank account to prove it. His wife, Margaret, had left him 5 years ago, tired of coming second to conference calls and acquisition meetings. His daughter Emily called once a month out of obligation, her voice polite and distant. Richard told himself he didn't mind the loneliness. Success required sacrifice, and he'd sacrificed plenty. Tuesday morning started like any other. Richard left his penthouse at 7:30, nodded curtly to the doorman, and began his daily walk to the office. He preferred walking those 6 blocks. It gave him time to mentally prepare for the day, to armor himself against the world with thoughts of numbers and negotiations. The city was waking up around him, coffee shops opening their doors, street vendors setting up their carts, the usual symphony of urban morning life. That's when he first noticed the musician. The man sat on a folding stool at the corner of 5th and Maple, right in Richard's path. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older, with silver hair pulled back in a small ponytail and hands weathered by more than age. A Vietnam veteran's cap sat on his head, faded and worn. His guitar was old, its wood scratched and dull, and he played with his eyes closed, singing something soft that Richard didn't recognize. A cardboard sign leaned against his guitar case. Music for hope. Anything helps. God bless. Richard felt irritation flare in his chest. He'd walked this route for 15 years without obstruction, and now this. This person was cluttering his morning with noise. The man's voice cracked on a high note, and Richard actually winced. As he passed, he caught the lyrics, something about coming home, about brothers lost, about finding peace in old memories. The guitar case held maybe $3 in change and a crumpled $5 bill. Without thinking, Richard stopped. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a penny, and with theatrical precision, dropped it into the case from shoulder height. It clinked against the few coins already there, a sound somehow both tiny and insulting. The old man opened his eyes, and for just a moment they made contact. The musician's eyes were a pale blue, kind and clear, and they held no anger at the gesture, just a quiet understanding that made Richard even more annoyed. Maybe invest in some lessons, Richard said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who's never had to perform for strangers. Or better yet, get a real job. You're making this corner look like a homeless shelter. A woman walking by gasped softly. A young man in a delivery uniform shook his head and deliberately dropped a $10 bill into the case as he passed, glaring at Richard. But Richard didn't care about their judgment. He was already walking away, his mind already moving to the morning's first meeting about the Riverside property acquisition. The musician didn't respond, just quietly started playing again, his fingers finding the chords like they were old friends. Richard made it to his office, conducted 3 meetings, signed off on 2 contracts, and approved the demolition of a community center to make room for luxury condos. Tuesday was productive. He worked until 7, ate dinner at his desk, sushi from the place that knew his order by heart, and finally headed home as the sun set. He didn't think about the musician again until he was lying in bed, and even then, it was only a fleeting thought. Some people made it in this world and some didn't. That wasn't his problem. But Wednesday morning changed everything. Richard woke to 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages, all from his assistant Patricia. His heart hammered as he checked them. Emergency. Need you to call immediately. He dialed, his hand suddenly unsteady. Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice tight with emotion. Richard, you need to see this. It's everywhere. The video. Someone recorded what you said yesterday. What video? Richard asked, but somewhere deep down he already knew. The street musician. Someone filmed the whole thing, you dropping the penny, what you said to him. It's gone viral. 3 million views overnight. The news outlets are picking it up. Richard, they found out who you are. They're digging into everything. The community center demolition, the lawsuit from last year. It's bad. Richard sat up, his silk sheets suddenly feeling like they were suffocating him. He grabbed his laptop with shaking hands and opened social media. There he was, captured in crystal-clear video, his face twisted in contempt as he insulted an elderly veteran. The comments were brutal. Thousands of people calling him heartless, cruel, everything he'd pretended not to be for so many years. His company was already trending for all the wrong reasons, but it was the next message from Patricia that made his blood run cold. There's something else, about the musician. Richard, you need to know who he really is. Richard's fingers fumbled with his phone as Patricia's voice came through, heavy with something he couldn't quite identify. His name is Thomas McAllister. He's 73 years old, Purple Heart recipient. He served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home to nothing, no job, no support, just memories that wouldn't let him sleep. He's been playing music on street corners for 15 years, but Richard, that's not the important part. Richard's throat tightened. He didn't want to hear more, but Patricia continued, her voice breaking slightly. He uses every dollar he makes to buy meals for other homeless veterans. Every single dollar. There's a shelter on 9th Street. They confirmed he brings them food 3 times a week, pays for it out of his own pocket. He lives in a single room above a laundry on the east side, barely keeps himself fed, but he makes sure his brothers eat. The ones who came home broken like he did. The laptop screen blurred in front of Richard's eyes. He clicked on another article, then another, each one painting a picture that made his stomach churn. There were photos of Thomas with other veterans, his arm around their shoulders, his face lit with genuine warmth. There were testimonials from shelter workers who called him a saint. There was an interview from 2 years ago with a local paper where Thomas talked about music being his therapy. His way of staying connected to the world after war had tried to disconnect him forever. I play because it keeps me human, Thomas had said in that interview. When people stop to listen, even for just a moment, I remember that I'm still here, still part of something. The money doesn't matter much. What matters is the moment, the connection. Richard closed the laptop. His penthouse suddenly felt like a mausoleum, all glass and steel and empty space. He looked around at the expensive art on his walls, pieces he'd bought because his decorator said they'd appreciate in value, not because they moved him. He thought about Margaret, how she'd begged him to slow down, to remember what mattered. He thought about Emily, how her voice had sounded last Christmas when he'd cancelled their dinner plans for a business opportunity. He thought about all the people he'd stepped on climbing his way up, all the times he'd mistaken cruelty for strength. His phone rang. The board of directors, then his lawyer, then a journalist. Richard turned it off and sat in silence as the morning sun streamed through his floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating everything he'd built and making it all look hollow. By noon, the situation had escalated. Protests had gathered outside his office building. His company's stock was dropping. Major clients were issuing statements about reviewing their relationships with Holloway Properties. His face was on the news, that cruel smirk frozen in time, contrasted with images of Thomas feeding homeless veterans from paper plates in a church basement. The internet had done what the internet does best. It had found every questionable decision Richard had ever made in business and laid them out like evidence in a trial. But worse than all of that, worse than the financial losses, the ruined reputation, the public humiliation, was the weight that had settled in Richard's chest. It felt like someone had placed a stone there, and it grew heavier with each passing hour. He kept seeing Thomas's eyes, that moment of quiet understanding before Richard had walked away. The old man hadn't cursed him or argued. He'd just accepted the cruelty like he'd accepted so many things in his 73 years, and that acceptance somehow hurt more than anger would have. Richard found himself pulling up the video again, watching it on loop. With each viewing, he saw something new. The way Thomas's fingers had paused on the guitar strings when the penny hit the case. The slight sag in his shoulders. The deep breath he'd taken before starting to play again. Richard had wounded this man, casually and publicly, and then walked away without a second thought. What kind of person did that? What kind of person had he become? His sister Laura called around too. Richard almost didn't answer, but Laura had a way of knowing when he needed her, even though they only spoke every few months. "I saw," she said simply. "Rich, I saw what you did." "I know," he whispered. His voice sounded strange, unfamiliar. "I know what I did, Laura. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." "Do you want to fix it because of the business fallout?" Laura asked gently. "Or because you're genuinely ashamed of who you've become?" Richard sat with that question, really sat with it, and felt something crack open in his chest. "Both," he admitted. "God help me, Laura, it's both. But mostly I can't stop thinking about his face. About how many people I've looked at that way. About how Mom and Dad would feel if they could see me now." Laura was quiet for a moment. "Then you know what you need to do. You need to find him. You need to apologize. Not through a press release or a publicist. Face to face, human to human. And Rich, you need to mean it. Actually mean it. If this moment touched your heart, please give this story a thumbs up." Richard hung up and stood, his legs unsteady. He changed out of his suit and into jeans and a simple sweater, clothes he hadn't worn in years. He walked out of his penthouse, ignoring the doorman's surprised expression, and headed toward 5th and Maple. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and the city felt different somehow, more alive and more judgmental all at once. People recognized him on the street. Some glared. One woman spat at his feet. Richard kept walking. But when he reached the corner where Thomas had been, there was nothing. Just empty sidewalk and the ghosts of yesterday. Richard asked the coffee shop owner if he'd seen the musician. "Haven't seen Tom in 2 days, the man said, his voice cold. "Wonder why he might want to avoid this corner." Richard felt the stone in his chest grow impossibly heavier. He'd driven Thomas away. The old man who'd survived war and poverty and decades of struggle had finally been driven from his spot by Richard's cruelty. And now, standing there in the space where it had happened, Richard realized he didn't just want forgiveness for his business's sake. He needed it for his soul. Richard spent Wednesday afternoon searching. He went to every corner within a 10-block radius, looking for a silver-haired veteran with a beaten guitar. Coffee shop workers shook their heads. Street vendors hadn't seen him. Other musicians said Tom usually worked 5th, and Maple, had for years, never caused trouble. "He's a good man," a young woman with a violin told Richard, her eyes hard with recognition. "I'm guessing you're the reason he's gone." As evening fell, Richard found himself at the Veterans Shelter on 9th Street. It was a humble building, its brick facade weathered but clean, with a hand-painted sign that read, "Safe Harbor Veterans Center." Inside, the smell of cafeteria food mixed with coffee and old linoleum. Men of various ages sat at tables, some playing cards, others just staring at nothing in particular. They all looked up when Richard walked in, and the room went quiet. An older woman approached, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and assessing. "I know who you are," she said simply. "I'm Dorothy Chen. I run this place. If you're here to cause more trouble..." "I'm here looking for Thomas McAllister," Richard interrupted, and he was surprised to hear his voice crack. "Please, I need to find him. I need to apologize." Dorothy studied him for a long moment. Around them, the veterans watched with the particular stillness of men who'd learned to read danger in any situation. "Tom hasn't been here in 2 days, she finally said. "He usually comes Wednesday afternoons with sandwiches, but he didn't show." "We're worried about him." Richard's heart sank. "I'm the reason he's not here. I'm the reason he's hiding. He stopped, words failing him. "How did you explain cruelty to people who'd been on the receiving end of it their whole lives? How did you make them understand you hadn't known, hadn't thought, hadn't cared enough to see the human behind the uniform?" "I was cruel to him," Richard said quietly. I said terrible things. I didn't know who he was, but that's not an excuse. I didn't care who he was. I saw someone I thought was beneath me, and I treated him like he was nothing. The confession felt like pulling glass from a wound. I've spent my whole life treating people like they were nothing. I've been so focused on winning that I forgot there were actual human beings on the other side of my deals. My wife left me because I chose a conference call over our anniversary dinner. My daughter won't talk to me because I missed her college graduation for a property closing. And now I've heard a man who sacrificed more in one day of his life than I've sacrificed in my entire existence. One of the veterans, a man who looked to be in his 50s with one leg and a cane, spoke up. "Tom saved my life," he said. His voice was rough like gravel. "Not in the war. 3 years ago, I was on the bridge ready to jump. Tom found me. He didn't know me from Adam, but he sat with me for 6 hours, played his guitar, told me stories, talked about hope like it was something real, something you could hold on to. He bought me dinner with money from his guitar case and brought me here. I've been sober 2 years because of him." Another man nodded. "He paid for my daughter's birthday present last year. I couldn't afford anything, and Tom gave me $40, said it was just sitting around. I found out later he didn't eat for 3 days after that. The stories came then, one after another. Thomas buying someone's medication. Thomas sitting with a dying veteran in the hospital because the man had no family. Thomas playing music at funerals, at Christmas dinners, at moments when these men needed to remember they were still alive, still mattered. Each story drove the stone deeper into Richard's chest until he could barely breathe. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Where would he go? Richard asked Dorothy, his voice barely a whisper. If he was hurt, if he needed to be alone, where would Thomas go? Dorothy looked at him for a long time. Whatever she saw in his face must have convinced her, because she finally said, "There's a place. A small park about 3 miles north, near the old industrial district. It's where the Vietnam Memorial used to be before they moved it downtown. Tom goes there sometimes when things get hard. He says it helps him remember why he survived." Richard was already moving toward the door when Dorothy called out, "Mr. Holloway, Tom's got every reason to hate you, every reason to turn you away. But if there's one thing I know about that man, it's that he understands forgiveness better than anyone I've ever met. The question isn't whether he'll forgive you. The question is whether you can forgive yourself." Richard stepped out into the cool evening air. The city lights were coming on, turning the streets into rivers of gold and shadow. He had 3 miles to walk and a lifetime of mistakes to carry with him. Somewhere ahead was a 73-year-old veteran who'd learned to be kind in a world that had been nothing but cruel to him. And Richard, who'd learned only to be cruel in a world that had given him everything, was about to ask for something money couldn't buy. The park was small and forgotten, tucked between old warehouses that stood like silent witnesses to better days. A single streetlight illuminated a memorial bench and a bronze plaque embedded in stone, listing names of local soldiers who'd never come home from Vietnam. The grass needed cutting and litter gathered in the corners, but someone had placed fresh flowers on the memorial, wildflowers, the kind that grew along the highway. Gathered by hand, Thomas McAllister sat on the bench, his guitar across his lap, his fingers moving slowly across the strings without actually playing. He looked smaller than Richard remembered, more fragile in the dim light. His shoulders curved inward like he was trying to take up less space in the world. When Richard's footsteps crunched on the gravel path, Thomas's head lifted, and their eyes met. Richard stopped 10 feet away, suddenly uncertain. "What did you say to someone you'd wounded so carelessly? How did you begin to bridge a gap that wide?" Thomas just watched him, waiting, his face unreadable in the shadows. "I'm sorry," Richard said, and the words came out rough, inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Mr. McAllister, for what I said. For how I treated you, for—" His voice broke and he let it break. "For being exactly the kind of person I taught myself to be. Cruel, dismissive. So wrapped up in my own importance that I forgot other people were even real." Thomas didn't respond immediately. His fingers found a chord on the guitar, played it softly. The sound hung in the air between them, gentle and sad. "Why are you here?" Thomas asked finally. His voice was quieter than Richard expected, worn thin by years and screaming and silence. "Is this about your business? Your reputation?" "No," Richard said, then stopped himself. "That's not true. It started that way. When I saw the video, when everything started falling apart, I wanted to fix it. I wanted to make it go away." He took a step closer, his hands shaking. "But then I learned about you, about what you do, who you are, and I realized that I've spent 58 years building a life that doesn't mean anything. I've accumulated money and property and success, but I haven't built a single thing that would matter if I died tomorrow. You've lived in a single room and given everything away, and you've built something I'll never have, a legacy of kindness, of actually mattering to people." Thomas's fingers stilled on the guitar. "You think apologizing will make you feel better?" There was no accusation in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "Maybe that's still selfish. Maybe I'm still doing this wrong. But I'm here because I can't carry what I did to you for another day. I'm here because you deserve better, because everyone I've ever stepped on deserved better. And I'm here because I want to be someone different. And I don't know how to start except by asking you, begging you to forgive me." The night air moved between them, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the closer sound of wind through weeds. Thomas stood slowly, setting his guitar carefully on the bench. He walked toward Richard, and Richard saw the lines in his face, the history written there in scars and sun damage, and too many years of sleeping rough. When Thomas was close enough that Richard could see his eyes clearly, he stopped. "I was going to quit," Thomas said softly. "After what happened, I thought about packing up my guitar and never playing in public again. I thought about how easy it would be to just disappear, give up, stop fighting to hold on to whatever piece of myself is left." His voice wavered. "You weren't the first person to be cruel, Mr. Holloway. You were just the first person to make me wonder if maybe everyone's right. Maybe I am just a waste of space." Richard felt tears on his face and didn't wipe them away. "You're not," he said desperately. "God, Mr. McAllister, you're the furthest thing from it. You're everything I'm not. Everything I should have been." Thomas reached out, and his weathered hand grasped Richard's shoulder. The touch was gentle, grounding. "We're all just trying to find our way home," Thomas said. "Some of us took longer routes than others. Some of us are still looking." He squeezed slightly. "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hate is too heavy. I've carried enough heavy things for one lifetime. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales." Richard made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What can I do? There must be something I can do, please." Thomas smiled then, a real smile that reached his tired eyes. "Well," he said slowly, "Safe Harbor could use a new heating system before winter. And there's 67 veterans who'd benefit from having someone advocate for them when landlords try to push them out. Someone with resources, maybe. Someone who understands property law." He paused. "And maybe someone who could sit with me on Wednesday afternoons and help deliver sandwiches. Someone who needs to remember that success isn't measured in dollars." Richard nodded, unable to speak. Thomas picked up his guitar and began to walk slowly down the path toward the streetlight. After a few steps, he turned back. "Coming?" he asked. "Long walk back to the world, Mr. Holloway. Better not to do it alone." Richard followed, and as they walked together through the forgotten park, Thomas began to play. The melody was simple and old, something about finding grace, and Richard listened like it was the most important sound he'd ever heard. 3 months later, Richard Holloway stood in the renovated Safe Harbor Veterans Center, watching as 50 people gathered for Thanksgiving dinner. The new heating system hummed efficiently in the background, and the walls wore a fresh coat of paint that volunteers had applied over 2 weekends. The old cafeteria tables had been replaced with newer ones, and the kitchen could now serve hot meals to twice as many people. But Richard's favorite addition was the small stage in the corner where Thomas sat with his guitar, playing soft music while people filled their plates. Richard had changed. Not overnight, real change never happened that way, but steadily, deliberately. He'd restructured his company, bringing in people who actually cared about communities instead of just profits. He'd stopped the community center demolition and instead renovated it, turning it into affordable housing for veterans. Some board members quit. His stock value fluctuated. But for the first time in decades, Richard looked at himself in the mirror and didn't feel empty. His daughter Emily stood beside him now, helping to serve mashed potatoes. She'd driven 8 hours from Boston when he'd called her, actually called her, and asked if she'd like to help him with something important. Their relationship was still healing, still fragile, but they were trying. Last week they'd had dinner together, and when she'd told him about her life, really told him, not just the surface details, he'd listened. He'd put his phone away and listened like her words were the only thing that mattered in the world. Margaret had reached out too, after she'd seen the news coverage of his work with Safe Harbor. They'd met for coffee, awkward at first, then gradually warming. She didn't want to reconcile. Too much time had passed, too many wounds had scarred over, but she told him she was proud of what he was doing. "I always knew this person was in there somewhere," she'd said, touching his hand briefly. "I'm glad you finally met him." Thomas finished his song and caught Richard's eye, waving him over. Richard excused himself and navigated through the crowd, returning greetings from veterans who'd become his friends. There was Marcus, the man with one leg who'd almost jumped from a bridge, now working as a peer counselor. There was Jimmy, whose daughter's birthday present Thomas had funded, now reunited with his family and 6 months sober. There was Dorothy, who'd given Richard his first real task, sitting with a dying veteran named Carl for 3 days straight. Just being present, just showing up. Good turnout, Thomas said, his eyes twinkling. At 73, he still looked weathered, but there was a lightness to him now. He'd moved out of his single room into a small apartment that Richard's company had made available. Nothing fancy, but warm and safe with proper heat and no leaking pipes. Thomas still insisted on paying what rent he could, though Richard had tried to argue. "A man needs his dignity," Thomas had said firmly, and Richard had understood. Dignity wasn't something you could buy for someone. It was something you honored in them. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for giving me a chance. For not turning me away," Thomas shook his head. "Thank you for showing up." That's all any of us can do. Show up and try to do better than we did yesterday. He strummed a few chords. "You know, I've been thinking about that day. When you dropped that penny. For a long time I was angry. Then I was hurt. But now I think maybe it needed to happen. Maybe we both needed it. You needed to hit bottom to realize you wanted to climb back up. And I needed to remember that one person's cruelty doesn't define my worth." Richard sat beside him on the stage edge. "I've been thinking about something you said that night in the park. About us all trying to find our way home. I think I spent my whole life building walls and calling them home. Big walls, expensive walls, walls that kept everyone out. But home isn't supposed to keep people out. It's supposed to welcome them in. Now you're learning," Thomas said with a smile. He began to play again, and this time Richard recognized the melody. It was the same song Thomas had been playing that morning on 5th and Maple, the morning everything changed. But it sounded different now, or maybe Richard was different now, and that changed how he heard it. The lyrics about coming home, about finding peace, about brothers who'd survived together, they meant something new. Emily brought them both plates of food, kissing Richard's cheek before returning to the serving line. Dorothy announced it was time to say what they were grateful for, a tradition she insisted on despite the groans from some of the younger veterans. One by one, people spoke. They were grateful for safety, for friendship, for second chances. When it was Richard's turn, he stood, his voice steady but soft. "I'm grateful for rock bottom," he said, and a few people laughed, understanding exactly what he meant. "I'm grateful that I got a chance to become someone better before it was too late. I'm grateful for a 73-year-old veteran who taught me that kindness isn't weakness, and that forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you receive as grace." He looked at Thomas. "And I'm grateful that I get to spend however many years I have left trying to build something that actually matters." The room erupted in applause, and Richard sat down quickly, overwhelmed. Thomas squeezed his shoulder. That same gentle touch from the park, grounding and real. "You're doing fine," the old veteran whispered. "We're all doing just fine." As the evening wound down and people began to leave with full stomachs and fuller hearts, Richard helped clean up. He scrubbed tables and swept floors and took out trash, and none of it felt beneath him because nothing was beneath him anymore. He'd learned that everyone's work had dignity, that everyone's story mattered, that the measure of a life wasn't in bank accounts, but in moments of genuine connection. Walking home later, Richard passed the corner of 5th and Maple. Thomas played. There sometimes still. But now people recognized him as a local hero. The coffee shop named a drink after him. The newspaper had done a feature story. Kids from the local high school came to hear his stories about Vietnam and music and survival. And Richard stopped by every Friday morning not to listen to the music, though the music was beautiful, but to sit beside his friend and remember that 24 hours could change everything if you let them. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May we all find the courage to show up, to change, and to choose kindness when the world makes it easy to choose otherwise. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.